Have you ever thought about how weird it is, the difference between how we experience the world, all this solid objects and colors and stuff, and what science says is actually going on way down deep with particles and fields and all that?
Yeah, it's almost like the tomato on your kitchen table is from a completely different reality than the atoms it's made of. You know what I mean?
Totally, yeah. And that's kind of the head scratcher we're going to try to untangle today, this whole idea of the manifest image. That's philosopher speak for our everyday common sense picture of the world.
Right. And it gets really interesting when you start to think about how that everyday picture, the manifest image, bumps up against the scientific image, which is all about the fundamental building blocks of reality. How do those two fit together?
Yeah, is the world we see and feel just some kind of elaborate illusion, or is there something more to it? To guide us through this, we're going to dive deep into the work of Wilfrid Sellars.
He's the philosopher who really brought this tension between the manifest image and the scientific image to the forefront. And along the way, we'll be pulling insights from some other big thinkers like John Russell Roberts, Keith Allen, John Heil, Trenton Merricks, and Thomas Sadek.
We'll see what they have to say about how our brains might be involved in creating this manifest image, how to think about the reality of ordinary objects versus the reality of tiny particles, and maybe even touch upon some mind-bending ideas from physics, like the possibility of emergent spacetime.
Buckle up, it's going to be a wild ride.
So let's start with this idea of the manifest image. Can you unpack that a little bit? What are we really talking about when we say that?
Well, imagine you're just going about your day, right? You see a tree, you feel the wind on your skin, you hear a bird singing, all of that, that's your manifest image.
It's the world as we directly experience it before we start analyzing it or breaking it down into its scientific components.
Exactly. And it feels so real, so immediate, so solid. It's the world of tables and chairs and trees, not quarks and leptons.
And we intuitively feel like those things, those tables and trees, have certain qualities like colors, shapes, textures that just belong to them.
Right. And it seems so obvious, doesn't it? But when you start to think about it, where do those qualities actually come from? If, as science tells us, the world is ultimately made of these tiny particles that don't inherently possess those qualities, how do they arise in our experience?
That's a good question. I mean, we all know that atoms don't have colors, right? So how do we see a red apple? Where does that redness come from?
That's where things get really interesting.
Yeah.
And that's why we have to consider the role that our own brains might be playing in this whole process. But before we get to that, let's take a step back and consider what some of these philosophers had to say about this tension between the manifest image and the scientific image.
Okay, sounds good. So John Russell Roberts, he wrote about this idea of common sense and how even philosophers who were skeptical of the material world, like George Berkeley, still had to grapple with it.
Right, Berkeley's a fascinating case. I
Yeah.
mean, he was the guy who famously said, "To be is to be perceived." He believed that the existence of things depends on them being perceived by a mind.
So for Berkeley, there's no mind-independent material world out there. Everything exists because it's being thought of ultimately by God.
Exactly. But even Berkeley, as Roberts points out, had to acknowledge the power and persistence of the manifest image, the common sense view of the world that most people hold. He called it siding with the mob.
So even if you believe that reality is ultimately mental, you still have to deal with the fact that we experience the world as this collection of seemingly solid, independent objects.
Right. And as Roberts points out, the idea of material substance, this notion of stuff existing independently of our minds, isn't actually a direct element of our common sense. It's more of a philosophical idea that developed over time.
Interesting. So it's not like we're born with this innate understanding of material substance. It's something that our culture and our education instill in us.
Right, and I think that's important to keep in mind because it shows that even our most basic assumptions about reality are shaped by our cultural and intellectual background. But even without that philosophical framework of material substance, we still have this fundamental experience of a world filled with distinct objects and their qualities.
Yeah, we don't need to know about atoms to see that an apple is red and round.
Exactly. And that brings us back to this question of how those qualities arise in our experience. Now, Keith Allen talks about this in relation to color perception. He uses the example of color constancy, which is pretty amazing when you think about it.
Yeah, color constancy is this phenomenon where we perceive the color of an object as remaining relatively stable, even when the lighting conditions change.
Right, so imagine you're looking at a white piece of paper. As the lighting in the room changes, the actual wavelengths of light reflecting off the paper and hitting your eyes will change dramatically. But you still perceive the paper as white.
It's like our brains are somehow compensating for those changes in illumination so that our experience of color remains consistent.
Exactly, and that suggests that what we perceive isn't simply a passive reflection of the physical world. It's more like our brains are actively constructing our experience of color.
So, in a way, the color we see isn't really in the object itself, but rather it's something our brains create based on the sensory information they receive.
Right, and Alan's point is that this is a strong indication that our perception is an active process, not just a passive reception of objective data.
So our brains are like little artists, constantly creating this beautiful and coherent picture of the world for us.
I like that analogy. And if that's the case, then it raises this really fundamental question. What are these everyday objects that we experience, these apples and chairs and trees, in relation to the fundamental particles and fields that science describes?
Yeah, if the world is ultimately made of these tiny, colorless, shapeless particles, how do we get the rich and complex world of objects that we see and feel around us?
That's the million-dollar question. John Heil tackles this head-on in his work. He asks whether ordinary objects are nothing over and above, nothing in addition to, or perhaps even nothing but certain configurations of those fundamental particles.
In other words, is a chair just a bunch of atoms arranged chairwise? Is there anything more to it than that?
Right, and there are a variety of philosophical positions on this. Some philosophers, known as eliminativists, would argue that strictly speaking, only the fundamental particles really exist.
So for them, there's no such thing as a chair, only a collection of atoms in a particular arrangement.
Right, and they might say that our talk of chairs and tables is just a convenient shorthand, a way of simplifying a complex reality. It's like saying, hey, look, there's a chair-shaped cloud of atoms over there.
That's a pretty radical way of looking at things.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems like common sense tells us that chairs exist.
It does, but eliminativists would argue that common sense can be misleading. They'd say that our intuitions about objects are based on a pre-scientific understanding of the world.
So they're basically saying that we need to update our ontology, our understanding of what exists, to match the findings of science.
Exactly. But even eliminativists acknowledge that our everyday talk about objects has its uses. We wouldn't want to go around describing everything in terms of particles and fields. It would be incredibly cumbersome and impractical.
I guess that's true, but it still feels weird to think that the things we interact with every day might not actually exist in the way we think they do.
And it gets even weirder when you consider this problem of co-location, which both Trenton, Merricks, and Thomas Sadig have written about.
Co-location, what's that?
It's this puzzle that arises when you think about objects that seem to occupy the same space at the same time. The classic example is a statue and the lump of clay it's made of.
So you have this lump of clay, and then you mold it into the shape of a statue. Now, it seems like the statue and the lump of clay are both occupying the same space.
Right, and that raises the question, are they the same thing, or are they two different things?
Intuitively, it feels like they're different. I mean, a statue has certain properties, like being beautiful or representing a certain figure, that a lump of clay doesn't have.
Exactly. And you could even destroy the statue while leaving the lump of clay intact, so they can have different fates.
But if they're different things, how can they occupy the same space at the same time?
That's the crux of the problem, and it really challenges our common sense view of objects as distinct and separate entities.
So how do philosophers try to solve this puzzle?
Well, Sadik proposes this interesting solution called perspectival hylomorphism. It's a mouthful, but it basically means that an object can have different properties depending on your perspective.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
So in the case of the statue and the lump of clay, Sadig would say that they have different properties depending on whether you're looking at them from a sortal-sensitive perspective or a sortal-abstract perspective.
Those are some more big words. What do they mean?
A sortal-sensitive perspective is when you're thinking about an object in terms of its specific kind, like statue. A sortal-abstract perspective is when you're thinking about it in terms of its underlying matter, like lump of clay.
So if I'm looking at the statue from a sortal-sensitive perspective, I'm focused on its artistic qualities, its shape, its meaning. But if I'm looking at it from a sortal-abstract perspective, I'm just seeing a lump of clay.
Exactly. And depending on your perspective, different properties will be relevant. So from a sortal-sensitive perspective, it makes sense to say that the statue is beautiful, but from a sortal-abstract perspective, that doesn't really apply.
That's really interesting. So it's like the object itself doesn't have a fixed set of properties. It all depends on how you're looking at it.
Right, and this perspectival approach helps to resolve the problem of collocation because it allows us to say that the statue and the lump of clay are both real, but they exist at different levels of description.
Okay, so we've explored this tension between the manifest image and the scientific image. We've delved into the role of the brain in constructing our perception, and we've even tackled the ontology of ordinary objects. Now, for the big question, is there any way to reconcile these seemingly disparate views of reality? Can we bridge the gap between our everyday experience and the scientific picture of the world?
That's the ultimate challenge, right? And there are a lot of smart people working on it. One approach comes from the work of Immanuel Kant, as discussed by Guillaume Allais. Kant proposed this idea of transcendental idealism.
Transcendental idealism sounds intimidating. What does it mean?
It basically means that the world we experience, the manifest image, is structured by our own minds. In other words, our minds aren't just passively receiving information from the world, they're actively shaping it.
So the world we see isn't the world as it really is, but rather the world as our minds make it appear to us.
Exactly. And Kant called this world of appearances the phenomenal world, to distinguish it from the noumenal world, the world of things in themselves, which is the world as it exists independently of our experience.
So the noumenal world is like the ultimate reality, but it's inaccessible to us because our minds can only grasp the phenomenal world.
Right, and this idea has some really interesting implications. For example, it suggests that the qualities we perceive in objects, like colors and shapes, aren't inherent properties of the objects themselves, but rather they're products of our own minds.
So the redness of an apple isn't really in the apple, it's something our minds project onto it.
Exactly. And this helps to explain how we can have this rich and colorful experience of the world, even though the underlying reality might be much more austere. It's like our minds are adding a layer of interpretation to the raw data of the senses.
So it's not that our senses are deceiving us, it's just that they're giving us a particular perspective on reality, a perspective that's shaped by our own cognitive faculties.
Right. And Allais also talks about this related idea called essential manifestness, which suggests that some qualities, like colors, might only exist within our perceptual experience and not as features of things as they are in themselves. It's not that colors are illusions, but they're more like the specific way reality presents itself to our particular kind of consciousness.
It's like our minds are equipped with a certain set of tools for understanding the world, and colors are one of those tools.
Exactly. And this idea of the mind playing an active role in shaping reality has even made its way into modern physics, particularly in theories of quantum gravity, as discussed by Christian Wüthrich and his colleagues.
Quantum gravity, that sounds heavy. What's the connection there?
Well, some theories of quantum gravity suggest that space-time itself, the very fabric of reality, might not be fundamental but rather emergent.
Emergent, what does that mean?
It means that space-time might arise from some deeper, more fundamental level of reality, just like water emerges from the interactions of a huge number of water molecules.
So the smooth, continuous space-time we experience might be just a large-scale approximation of some much more complex and granular underlying structure.
Exactly. And if space-time itself is emergent, then that raises the question of what the objects within space-time are. I mean, if the stage itself is an illusion, what about the actors on the stage?
That's a great analogy. It really makes you rethink everything you thought you knew about the nature of reality.
It does, and it suggests that the relationship between the manifest image and the scientific image might be even more complex and intertwined than we previously thought. It's not just that our minds shape our perception of reality, but that reality itself might be shaped by the very structure of our minds.
Whoa, that's a mind-blowing thought. So we've gone from questioning the reality of chairs to questioning the reality of space-time itself.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey. But even if space-time is emergent, that doesn't mean our everyday experience is meaningless or illusory. It just means that we need to be careful about assuming that our common sense view of the world is the whole story.
Right, and that's where philosophy comes in. It helps us to critically examine our assumptions and to develop more nuanced and sophisticated understandings of reality.
Exactly. And one final perspective I'd like to bring in is from Michael Williams, who has written about the role of our concepts in shaping our understanding of the world. He argues that even our most basic observational concepts like red or table are shaped by a complex interplay between our cognitive architecture and the world around us.
So it's not just that our brains process sensory information, it's that our entire way of thinking, our conceptual framework, influences how we perceive and understand the world.
Precisely. Our concepts, even seemingly simple ones, are embedded in a whole system of how we interact with and make sense of the world around us.
So it's like our minds and the world are engaged in this ongoing dance, each shaping and influencing the other.
Exactly. And that's a really profound idea. It suggests that the relationship between mind and world is much more intimate and dynamic than we often assume.
So to bring it all back around, we've been exploring this fascinating puzzle of the manifest image, the everyday world we experience, and how it relates to the scientific image, the world of particles and fields. And what we've seen is that there's no easy answer. There's no simple way to say, okay, the manifest image is just an illusion, or the scientific image is the only true reality.
Right. It's much more complicated than that. Our brains play an active role in shaping our perception. The relationship between ordinary objects and fundamental particles is complex and philosophically challenging, and even the nature of space-time itself is up for debate.
So it seems like the best we can do is to keep exploring these questions, to keep challenging our assumptions, and to keep refining our understanding of the world and our place in it.
And that's what philosophy is all about. It's about questioning everything, pushing the boundaries of our understanding, and striving for a more complete and nuanced picture of reality.
Exactly. And it's a journey that never really ends. There's always more to discover, more to learn, more to question.
And that's what makes it so exciting. So for all you listeners out there, keep those philosophical gears turning. Keep asking those big questions about the nature of reality, the self, and our place in the universe. Because the more we question, the more we learn, the more we grow.
And who knows, maybe one day we'll crack this whole manifest image puzzle wide open. But even if we don't, the journey itself is worth it. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Until next time.